The paramedics had already lowered their hands. The little screen on the machine showed nothing but a flat green line, and the diner had gone quiet in the way a place goes quiet when the people inside stop believing there is anything left to try. A man in a camel-colored coat stood frozen by the counter, his phone still open in his palm. A waitress pressed a dish towel to her mouth. The manager kept saying the woman's name softer and softer, as if volume were the only thing keeping her here. She had collapsed near the register 11 minutes earlier and had not taken a breath on her own since. Then a girl in a faded delivery jacket stepped through the front door. Nobody looked at her. She was maybe 16, thin, with sneakers wrapped in silver tape, and the kind of stillness that grows in a person who has spent years being walked past. She had followed the ambulance on her bicycle from 4 blocks away because she had seen the crowd forming, and something in her chest told her to pedal harder. She reached the woman's side before a single hand rose to stop her. What she did in the next 90 seconds would be argued over in that little town for the rest of everyone's lives. Before we go on, if you believe that courage keeps no address and that goodness can walk in wearing tape on its shoes, please like this video, subscribe, and send this to someone who needs to believe in people again tonight. The girl had been without a steady roof over her head for nearly a year. Not the streets exactly, but the edge of them. She moved between a women's shelter that emptied out by 8 each morning and a boarded-up laundromat, where she had learned which back windows still gave, where a folded moving blanket and a milk crate had become as close to a bedroom as a person can build out of dust and quiet. Her backpack held 4 things: a spare pair of socks, a cracked flip phone that no longer called anyone, a photograph of her grandmother in a church hat, and a battered spiral-bound field guide for wilderness first responders that she had pulled from a free bin outside a sporting goods store 2 winters back, read so many times the cover had come loose from the spine. That guide matters. Keep it in mind. She had loved the idea of rescue since she was 7, the year her older brother went under at a public pool, and a lifeguard, a boy barely out of high school, had pulled him up and worked over him with hands so calm and so certain that she had decided in that instant this was the most important thing a person could ever know how to do. She wanted to understand it. How a body stops. What holds it back from starting again. What a pair of steady hands can do in the gap between the two. Without a school she could stay enrolled in, without a library card that survived having no address, she read whatever the world left lying around. Donated pamphlets, water-stained manuals set out on curbs, that worn field guide, with its chapter on sudden collapse, on what to do when a person's heart quits and the seconds start to matter more than anything money could ever buy. She had read that chapter more times than she could count. She never once imagined she would need it. The morning it happened started like most of her mornings. She was sitting on the low wall outside the shelter, splitting a day-old bagel in half and watching the town wake up around her. She noticed the man first. A camel coat, running the way men in expensive coats almost never run, arms pumping, dignity forgotten, because something had burned away everything in him except the emergency in front of him. He was shouting into his phone about the diner on 3rd Street. She stood. She could not have told you why. She simply did. She grabbed her bicycle and followed. By the time she reached the diner, the ambulance was already outside, its back doors open. She slipped in behind 2 men holding the door and moved toward the crowd gathered at the counter. She arrived just as the lead paramedic straightened up and let his shoulders drop, and said the quiet thing that no one in a room is ever ready to hear. The woman was 62 years old. She ran the register 3 mornings a week. She had gone down without a sound between the coffee pots and the pie case, and by the time anyone understood what was happening, the long minutes had already begun stacking up against her. The crew had worked hard. They had done everything the protocol asked. Nothing had answered them back. The man in the camel coat, the one who had run, was pressed against the wall by the jukebox. He had built one of the largest commercial real estate firms in 3 counties from a single storefront, and in 40 years of business, he had never met an obstacle that patience and a large enough check could not eventually move. The woman on the floor was his aunt, the only family he had left who still called on his birthday, and he was entirely, completely helpless. And then a girl in a taped-up jacket knelt down at her side. She had seen something the instant she came through the door. A flicker, the smallest shift at the base of the woman's throat, a movement so faint that every trained eye in the room had already moved past it. She did not stop to explain herself. She did not ask. She lowered herself to the floor, tipped the woman's head the exact way the guide had drawn it, cleared the airway with 2 careful fingers, and laid the heel of her hand where the chapter had marked with a small black X, and began, steady and even, the rhythm she had practiced on a rolled blanket 100 times in a dark laundromat, because it was the one thing no one had ever been able to take from her. That is when the paramedic said, "Step back, kid." That is when the man in the coat said, "What is she doing?" That is when the manager reached for her shoulder. She did not stop. She said, quietly, without lifting her eyes, "Please, just give me 1 minute." Something in the way she said it held the room in place. Not loudness, not authority, something underneath those things. The particular steadiness of a person who is not pretending to be sure, but simply is, earned across 2 years of reading the same chapter over and over in a cold room with a milk crate for a desk, because the human body fascinated her, and knowledge was the single thing no hard season had ever managed to strip away. 40 seconds passed. Then the woman gasped. Then she coughed. Then her chest rose on its own, and the whole room broke into motion at once. The paramedics dropping back to their knees, the monitor leads snapping into place, the waitress with the dish towel sinking onto a stool with both hands pressed flat against her heart. The man in the camel coat slid down the wall until he was sitting on the checkered floor, his face in his hands, making a sound that was not quite weeping and not quite anything a person has a name for. The girl sat back on her heels, let the professionals move in around her, and rose to collect the bicycle helmet she had dropped by the door. She was nearly out on the sidewalk before the man lifted his head and called after her. "Wait. Before we go on, we want to stop here. Because what she did on that floor is the part of this story you can see. But we want you to know what made it possible." 2 winters before that morning, a stock clerk carried a crate of returned merchandise out to the free bin behind the sporting goods store at the end of a double shift. She did not sort through it. She did not wonder who might come by. She simply set it out instead of tossing it in the dumpster, because throwing away perfectly good books had always felt wrong to her. The girl found that crate at dawn. She took one thing from it. A retired river rescue instructor ran a free hands-on session in the basement of the shelter on the first Thursday of every month. He never asked who had a home to go back to. The girl came to 4 of those Thursdays. He showed the group the exact rhythm, the exact placement, the exact reason. The first 2 minutes decide everything. He never learned her name. She never forgot a word he said. And a night supervisor used to let the girl stay half an hour past the morning lockout on the coldest days, when she could see the child had nowhere warm to be. She never wrote it in the logbook. She simply did not turn the deadbolt until the girl had finished her reading. None of those 3 people were in that diner. All 3 of them were. This is what we believe. That every quiet act of decency travels far past the reach of the person who offered it. A crate on the curb. A free Thursday session. An unlocked door. All of it walked into that diner beside a girl in a taped-up jacket. The man in the camel coat caught up to her on the sidewalk. He had left his aunt in the hands of the crew and followed a child out into the cold, and he stood in front of her now with nothing rehearsed left in his face, nothing managed, just a man who had stood at the edge of the worst morning of his life and been pulled back by a girl who had refused to accept the thing everyone else had already accepted. He asked her where she lived. She told him the truth. He did not flinch, and he did not soften into the awkward pity that comes over people when hardship gets close enough to touch. He asked her 2 more things. What did she want to do with her life? And what did she need to do it? What came after was not charity. He made that plain from the start, and she would not have taken it any other way. He called it an investment. He had spent 40 years finding people with something rare in them and clearing the road so that thing could grow. He had simply never before found that person kneeling on a diner floor at 16 with a broken-backed field guide in her bag. She was back in school within the month. She moved in with a foster family his foundation had stood behind for years, a household with 4 other kids, and a kitchen that was never quiet, and a front door that stayed unlocked because someone was always coming or going through it. She got a tutor twice a week, a library card of her own, a winter coat that actually fit. She asked if she could keep the field guide. It had never once occurred to anyone to tell her no. For years later, she was the top student in her science program. At 17, she stood on a stage at a regional emergency medicine conference as the only high schooler invited, and she asked 2 questions that the physician on the panel later told a colleague were the sharpest anyone had put to him all weekend. The woman from the diner, still working the register 3 mornings a week, kept a photo of the girl taped to the side of the pie case, where she could see it while she counted out change. She told every customer who asked exactly whose face that was. The night before she left for her first year of nursing school, she sat at the kitchen table and wrote 3 letters. Not to the man in the coat, not to the doctors. She wrote the first to the stock clerk, whose name she had finally traced back through the sporting goods store. She wrote the second to the rescue instructor, retired now to a lake town 2 hours north. She wrote the third to the night supervisor. She told each of them what their small decision had made possible. The stock clerk wrote back within the week. She said she had not thought about that crate in 2 years, and she had cried at her kitchen sink, and then called her daughter to read the letter out loud a second time. The instructor wrote back on paper gone soft and yellow at the corners, and said he had run those first Thursdays for 14 years, and this was the first time in all of them he had ever heard what came after. The supervisor did not write back. But months later, the shelter director told the girl that she had framed the letter and hung it on the wall beside the door she still leaves unlocked on the coldest mornings. Never count a person out for where they are sleeping tonight. Never assume that a person with nothing knows nothing. Never mistake a quiet voice for an empty one, or worn-out shoes for a small and narrow life. And never forget that the knowledge which saves someone might be sitting in a crate on a curb, left there by a tired woman who simply could not bring herself to throw good things away. If this story moved you, please like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who needs to believe in people tonight. Subscribe for more stories of courage, quiet strength, and the small human choices that turn everything. Because rescue does not always arrive in a uniform. Sometimes it arrives on a bicycle, in a jacket held together with tape, carrying a book with a broken spine, and it stays down on the floor when everyone else has already stood up.